The strange thing about losing your wife after 30 years is realizing she had been disappearing long before the day she finally walked out. That was how Daniel Carter usually began the story whenever someone asked him about Mark Anderson. Daniel had known Mark for most of his adult life, and if there was one thing he believed now, it was that some men only understand love after the house becomes too quiet to ignore. Mark Anderson had always believed his life was stable, predictable, and secure. At 56 years old, he lived in a comfortable two-story house outside Columbus, Ohio, drove the same silver pickup truck he had owned for nearly a decade, and worked as a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company that made industrial air compressors. The job paid well, and Mark often said he had built a good life. What he didn't realize was that most of that life had been quietly built by someone else. Emily Anderson had met Mark when they were both in their early 20s. Mark liked to tell people he had fallen for her laugh first. It was soft. They had first met during a rainy afternoon in the fall of 1993. Emily had been working a part-time shift behind the counter while finishing community college, and Mark had stopped in for coffee after a long day at the auto parts warehouse where he worked back then. They talked for almost an hour that day. A year later, they were married in a small church with folding chairs and a reception that served homemade food brought by family members. Those early years were simple, but full of promise. Mark worked long hours trying to climb the ladder at his company, and Emily believed in him completely. She supported every late night, every business trip, every moment he said he had to miss dinner because work demanded more of him. When their son Lucas was born 3 years into the marriage, Emily stepped naturally into the role of holding the household together. She managed the bills, the school schedules, the grocery lists, and the quiet details that made a house feel like home. Mark often told his friends he was lucky, but the truth was, he rarely stopped long enough to really see why. Rain fills a bucket. Promotions arrived every few years, the paychecks got larger, and the responsibilities grew heavier. With every step forward in his career, something else slowly moved to the background. Dinner conversations became shorter. Weekend plans were often canceled. Birthdays were sometimes forgotten until the next morning. Emily never made a scene about it. She would simply smile and say something gentle like, "It's okay, we'll celebrate later." But later had a strange habit of never arriving. Daniel remembered visiting their home one evening about 15 years into the marriage. Mark was sitting at the dining table with his laptop open, answering emails while half-eaten dinner sat in front of him. Emily had already cleared her own plate and was quietly washing dishes at the sink. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic. There was no argument, no tension in the air. But Daniel noticed something in the silence between them that felt heavier than words. Mark, however, didn't notice anything at all. To him, it to pass in the comfortable rhythm Mark had come to expect. Lucas grew up, played high school baseball, and eventually left for a college 3 hours away. Emily attended every game when Lucas was younger. Mark tried to make it when he could, but business trips often got in the way. When Lucas moved out, the house felt a little larger and a little quieter. Emily suggested they take a weekend trip together sometime, maybe drive down to Tennessee or visit the coast in South Carolina. Mark nodded and said it sounded nice. But the calendar was always full, and the trip kept getting pushed to sometime next year. Daniel believed that was the period when Emily slowly began stepping back from the life she had spent decades holding together. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone. She simply stopped suggesting things. She stopped reminding Mark about little dates and anniversaries. She stopped waiting at the window when his truck pulled into the driveway. The changes were small enough that Mark barely registered them. One evening about 2 years before she left, with roasted potatoes and green beans. Mark arrived home, nearly 2 hours late after an unexpected meeting. The food had long since cooled on the stove. Emily warmed it again without complaint, placed the plate in front of him, and asked about his day. Mark talked about sales numbers and upcoming contracts. Emily listened quietly, nodding from across the table. Mark later told Daniel he remembered that night because it was the last time he could clearly recall Emily asking about his work with genuine curiosity. After that, conversations slowly became more practical. Did the water bill get paid? Was the trash taken out? What time would he be home tomorrow? The emotional space in the house grew wider each year, but Mark never thought to measure it. The morning Emily left began like any other Tuesday in late April. The sun had just started warming the streets, and Mark's alarm went off at 6:15 a.m. He showered, shaved, and walked into the kitchen expecting the usual routine. The coffee maker was already finished for years. But Emily wasn't there. Mark assumed she had stepped out for groceries or maybe gone for a walk. He poured himself a cup of coffee and noticed something unusual on the kitchen table. A single envelope rested beside the salt shaker. His name was written on the front in Emily's careful handwriting. Mark opened it without much concern. At first he thought it might be a reminder about an appointment or maybe instructions for a delivery. But as he read the first few lines, something unfamiliar crept into his chest. The letter was simple. Emily had never been dramatic with words. She wrote that she had spent many years believing things would change, believing that one day Mark would slow down long enough to notice the life they were living together. She wrote that she didn't blame him for working hard or building a career. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped feeling like a partner and started feeling like a quiet part of the furniture in his life. The final lines were the ones Mark read over and over that morning. Emily wrote, "I stayed for 30 years, believed in the life we started together. But belief isn't something one person can carry forever. I hope someday you understand that leaving wasn't sudden. It just took me 30 years to finish walking away." Mark sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour staring at that letter. At first he felt confused more than anything else. Emily had never threatened to leave. They had never had the kind of explosive arguments people described when marriages ended. Their life had always seemed calm, steady, almost routine. But the house felt different that morning in a way Mark couldn't explain. The refrigerator hummed a little louder. The ticking clock above the stove sounded sharper. And for the first time in decades, there was no quiet movement in another room reminding him someone else shared the space. Mark tried calling Emily later that day. The phone rang, but went to voicemail. He left a short message asking if everything was okay and where she had gone. The message sounded strangely formal even to him. Over the next few days, Mark continued with his routine, but something had shifted. The lights were off. The living room stayed exactly the way he left it. No folded laundry appeared on the couch. No note sat on the refrigerator reminding him about groceries. The absence of those tiny details slowly forced Mark to notice how much Emily had quietly done for 3 decades. Daniel visited Mark about a week after Emily left. He found his old friend sitting at the kitchen table again, the same envelope resting nearby. Mark looked tired, like someone who had been trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. That was when Mark said something Daniel never forgot. He said, "I always thought a marriage would tell you when something was wrong. I didn't know it could stay quiet for so long." Over the following months, Mark began noticing memories differently. He remembered Emily eating dinner alone on nights he worked late. He remembered the weekend trips she had suggested but never scheduled. He remembered the way her voice had gradually softened over the years, as if she had slowly stopped expecting to be heard. None of those moments had seemed important at the top to examine. People sometimes think love disappears in a single dramatic moment, but Daniel believed the truth was usually much quieter. Love fades in the background of busy schedules, postponed conversations, and small opportunities that pass unnoticed. By the time someone finally walks out the door, they have often been leaving. Piece by piece for years, Mark eventually learned that Emily had moved to a small town in North Carolina near the coast. She had taken a job at a local bookstore and rented a modest apartment a few blocks from the water. She wasn't running away from anything. She was simply building a life that felt visible again. Mark wrote letters during that first year, sometimes long ones filled with apologies and reflections he wished he had spoken earlier. Emily responded kindly, but rarely said much about the past. Her words were calm, thoughtful, and clear in a way Mark had never heard before. She told him she hoped he found peace and that she genuinely wanted him to be happy. What she never said was that she planned to. It was the hardest part for Mark to understand. Some goodbyes don't arrive with anger. They arrive with quiet certainty. Years later, whenever Daniel tells this story, he always ends with the same thought. He says the most dangerous assumption in a long marriage is believing the other person will always stay simply because they always have. Because sometimes love doesn't disappear suddenly. Sometimes it just waits patiently for someone to notice it. And if that moment never comes, the person who carried it the longest may finally decide it's time to set it down.